So I'm a grateful believer in Jesus Christ who struggles with addictions to meth, weed, food, cigarettes, sex, and porn. I also struggle with anxiety, depression, PTSD, codependency, pride, anger, and fear. And my name is Dru. Hi, guys. Growing up, I was one of 4 kids. I had an older brother and an older sister who had a different father, and then I had a little brother who shared the same father I had. I was raised with no knowledge of God, but from the outside looking in, we appeared normal. We seriously lacked communication skills and would often resort to fists to end our arguments. All too often, I witnessed my mom beat up my dad, then call the police and have him arrested. We spent many nights sleeping on the floor of a roach-infested pay-by-the-hour place called the Mary Kay Motel, just to get a break from the fighting and to get a few hours of sleep before school. My dad was my hero, and that caused a lot of friction between my siblings and my mother. He made sure my voice was heard. He protected me from as much of the sibling abuse as he could. And when I was 8, he developed a crack addiction and was forced to leave the house. This left my little brother and I to be raised by my siblings. Just what every kid needs, teenage authority figures. Needless to say, this was also the same year I learned how to smoke cigarettes to impress my sister's friends. I was also introduced to porn and masturbation during this year also. My mom worked 24-hour shifts at the hospital, trying to support us 4 kids. My house was a war zone. We lived in filth, infested with roaches, constantly being evicted, no water or electricity a lot of the time, and always having to park our car many streets away in hopes that it didn't get repossessed overnight. School was no safe place either. Since we moved a lot, I was always the tallest and the biggest kid in class, and it made me a prime target for bullying. Lonely is the word I would use to describe my childhood. There was no love at home. School was torture. The only safe place I had was on the sports field. I worked hard in school and at sports, thinking if I was perfect, then my mother would love me. If I was the best at something, maybe somebody would like me. Unfortunately, that's just not how life works. When I was 12, my soccer coach started groping me when no one was around. This really messed up my thinking. Although I knew it was wrong, it was still better than getting beat or called names. I felt guilty for not speaking up. I felt so much shame that shortly after I attempted suicide for the first time. I'd slit my wrist, but I was too scared to go very deep. Nobody noticed what I had done, but thankfully soon after, my sister took over my soccer team, and I finally had my safe place back. I was 16 before I got the nerve to talk in school. One of my bullies went after my cousin on the bus, and something snapped in me. I failed to stand up for myself, but that day I found the courage to stand up for my cousin. I followed that girl off the bus and communicated using the only skills I had at the time, my fists. I remember being so confused after that incident. That girl dropped out of school, but my family did everything but throw me a party. The name-calling decreased. School was no longer an issue anymore. Kids would move out of my way when I walked down the halls. Over the next few years, I threw myself into school, work, and sports. I graduated with a 4.75 out of a 4.0 and was offered both academic and sports scholarships to college. But the years of constant dislocations and torn ligaments had done severe damage to my body. By the time I was 18, I couldn't walk up or down steps anymore, and I would often dislocate just walking across a parking lot. The pain had become unbearable, but my mom would never get me medical attention. That would have required taking a day off of work. On December 5th, 1998, after a night of dancing at my sister's wedding, I attempted suicide for the second time. I swallowed an entire bottle of Furanol with codeine, and while sobbing, I laid down in my mom's bed. She dragged me by the hair to the bathroom and punched me in the stomach repeatedly until I vomited up enough pills that she was satisfied. I slept for 2 days, then returned to college like nothing had ever happened. When my dad got word of what happened, he took me to an orthopedic surgeon. We found out I had a connective tissue disorder called Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, and that my kneecaps were 2 inches higher and 2 inches more lateral than they were supposed to be. It took 6 surgeries to break my legs and realign them so I could walk normally. The pain was unbearable. I started smoking weed at 22 to cope. I left college shortly after and went to work for my brother. I met my ex-husband and was married in 2004. Although we had been together for 4 years, my marriage only lasted 4 months. We tried for our entire relationship to get pregnant and consulted a specialist in 2004 for help. I was informed that my ovaries had suffered too many ruptured cysts and conceiving would be a miracle. I felt I had nothing but poison to offer my husband. I had no communication skills. I was unable to give him a child, and shortly after I started having an affair that would result in the end of my marriage. I threw myself into my career and I earned my own window world in Columbia, Missouri. During a one-weekend stand in Springfield, Missouri on New Year's Eve 2005, I became pregnant. I had become that miracle that doctor talked about. During the pregnancy, an angel visited me in my dream and told me I would be having a son and his name would be Gabriel. On September 23, 2006, I gave birth to the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. When I looked in my son's eyes, I could no longer deny that God exists. I named him Gabriel. I wasn't ready at that time to walk with Christ, but I could finally see God in others. Finally, a few months after I gave birth, I started having a weird low back pain. Over the next year, the pain increased in severity, and the only answers the doctor gave me was that it was mental. I ruptured 2 discs in my neck that year, and the pain was changing me, and people were starting to notice. It took everything I had in me over the next year to just survive. That next September, I ended up in a coma for 4 days. It turns out I wasn't crazy after all. My thyroid had stopped functioning and my body and brain shut down because there was no energy to run it any longer. It took 2 years to recover from that coma. By the time I was in my right mind again, I had lost my business, my home, my vehicle, my boyfriend. I had to move back in with my mother, but I didn't lose everything. God had given me 2 miracles. While recovering from the coma, I found out I was pregnant with my daughter. I gave birth to a healthy baby girl that November. It took the next decade to get used to my body again. In addition to the Ehlers-Danlos syndrome and the thyroid issue, they also diagnosed me with fibromyalgia, mast cell activation syndrome, postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, diabetes, high blood pressure, and polycystic ovarian syndrome. Around 2012, I finally started to get a handle on all the triggers and the ways that my life had to change to make it functional again. That same year, I was blessed to move in with my father and my stepmom. My stepmom had had a heart attack that January, and my father needed help caring for her. She was the first person to start speaking God into my life. Even though she was very frustrated and angry over the physical shape of her body, she stayed true to her faith. She loved and nurtured me like I had never known and showed me how to be a lady. She accepted me just as I was. She passed that August, and a piece of my heart went with her. 4 months later, my dad had quadruple bypass. His heart was literally broken after the loss of my stepmom. I moved in with him because he could no longer be on his own. In January 2013, I started having new symptoms. I started passing out, mainly in the shower, in the bathroom. It felt like my muscles had wet concrete in them. It took everything I had just to walk to the kitchen. My left eye started drooping. I met my ex a couple months later, and because I had no self-esteem, I ignored all the blaring red flags. I was just happy someone was willing to deal with the mess I was medically. Over the next couple years, I spent time in and out of the hospital. They finally came to a diagnosis of myasthenia gravis, a neuromuscular disease that affects the voluntary muscles of the body, most dangerously the diaphragm. These episodes would leave me unconscious for days at a time. I learned that things like heat, gluten, chemicals, dyes, medicines, all could send me into an episode. I spent 3 days unconscious after cutting my son's hair once. They said the allergens on his hair is what set off the attack. I became terrified to get out of bed. I had no control over what my body would do, and I stayed in bed, then at least I could control where I was going to suffocate at. My ex took full advantage of separating me from anyone and anything that would expose the evil that lived in him. He abused me mentally, emotionally, physically, and sexually, all in the name of God for the next 5 years. I kept his secrets because he was good at convincing me it was my fault. After neck surgery in 2015, we were driving in my dad's truck, and I told him I wanted to stop the relationship. He slammed on the brakes at 70 miles an hour, and I wasn't wearing a seatbelt. I dodged death that day. I should have gone right through the windshield, but something lifted me, and I hit the roof instead. I was left with permanent nerve damage, and sadly, this chaotic life was normal to me. It never struck me as weird that I had to stab him 6 times to get him to stop choking me, because that's what my childhood was like. By the end of 2015, I had had 17 surgeries, over 100 hospital stays, and the unconscious episodes were getting worse. I desperately wanted out of my bed that had become a prison. My ex introduced me to meth, acting as if it was mercy to give me enough energy to get up. I had been raising my kids from my bed for 2 years at that point, and I was desperate. I never thought I was going to see 2016 anyway, so I gave it a try. Within a week, I was shooting meth every hour on the hour for the next 6 months. It did give me some energy. Even though I was stuck in bed, I went back to college online and worked to clean up my credit, and I was able to purchase a house in Colorado. In 2016, I got clean off the meth. I thought my ex did too, but it turns out he was still using. I moved my family to Colorado. I was closer to specialists that knew about the rare syndromes I had, and I started to make headway in my health. I had lost 241 pounds over the last couple years because my body rejected anything I put in it. It wasn't long after being in Colorado that it became apparent that my ex was still using. There were shady people around constantly, and everything I owned had disappeared, including the money I needed to feed my kids. And I still kept his secrets. On December 18th, 2016, after spending 4 days with no sleep because of a dislocated hyoid bone, my ex raped me. I dissociated, and the next thing I remember was getting tackled by 9 people in an emergency room and shot full of Haldol and restrained to the bed. After a very long nap, I awoke, restrained to the bed, and went into full panic attack, and I kept blacking back out. I prayed in my head for it all to end, and the calmest voice said, "Child, just breathe." Jesus used the bells in the emergency room and taught me how to breathe through a panic attack. He told me to count my breaths until I heard the 3rd bell, and it would pass. I was able to stay conscious and dislocate my shoulders to undo the restraints. When I got to my feet, I walked over to the window, and written in the fake snow on the nurse's station were the words, "He was here." They locked me in the psych ward for 4 days. Jesus held my hand the entire time. I was terrified and couldn't remember why I was even there. During this day, I started to get memories back of the rape, but I couldn't say it out loud. They just treated me for pain and sent me home. That was my final draw. Spending those 4 days locked down gave me a chance to look at my life and realize I was dating the devil. It took me 6 months to get my kids, my father, and myself out safely and back to Missouri. I wanted so bad to prosecute, but every time I tried to tell someone what happened, nothing would come out. I spent the next year in shock of everything I had survived from those 5 years. I couldn't understand why Jesus helped me when I had done everything wrong. In Hebrews 13:5, it says, "Never will I leave you, never will I forsake you." But at that time, I had no knowledge of the promises of God, nor did I know how to have a relationship with Him. But I know I needed to learn more. In February 2019, a friend of mine quit smoking weed. And my inflated pride thought, if he can quit smoking weed, surely I can. I realized pretty quick that I had no clue how to live sober. So I started going to NA meetings with him. I was so shy and had so much trouble around people that the NA meetings made me want to use more. That same friend suggested I come to a different kind of meeting with him called Celebrate Recovery. I agreed, and I brought my daughter that night with me, and I prayed in the parking lot before I entered to please give me a sign that I'm in the right place. When my daughter was little, she had a monkey called Chi-Chi that went everywhere with us. When we broke into small groups that night, I walked into the room that my group was in, and covering the walls was that same monkey. That was all the sign I needed. I immediately started a step study, and it changed my life. I dove into the material, but realized my first inventory that trusting anyone was a serious issue for me. And unfortunately, that applied to God too. Every time I tried to quit, He gently nudged me forward. Near the end of my first step study, Pastors Randy and Mary Jo took over Celebrate Recovery, and my walls started tumbling down. Mary Jo quickly became a spiritual mother, guiding me through the New Testament and finally learning the promises of God. A week before I graduated my first step study, my father died suddenly at home. I tried to bring him back with CPR, but I wasn't able to. I could have easily gotten lost, but my CR sisters surrounded me in love and encouragement, and I pushed on to graduate that following Friday. I had also read through the New Testament for the first time and learned that I could get high while reading the Bible. Yes. A whole new world opened for me, and I was hungry to learn more. It says in Jeremiah 29:13, "You will seek me and find me when you seek me with all your heart." I signed up for a second step study. The first one had brought so much healing and repairing of relationships that I thought were long broken, but mostly my dad had just died, and he was my best friend, and I had no clue how to live without him. During my second step study, God revealed my issue with anger, pride, and grief, and gently walked me through releasing all the negative that I was holding on to, and taught me that all those horrible names people called me were not true, that I was worthy, I was loved, and I had a purpose to fulfill here on earth. I was sitting at a stoplight on Gravois Bluffs Boulevard one day during my second step study, and the song Symphony by Switch was playing in the background. And I got this thought in my head, what if I'm a sympathy? Or what if I'm the sympathy? Or symphony, I can't even say it. And I started laughing, like hysterically. I had tears coming out. But I could feel God just patiently waiting. And like I snapped back and I said, God, am I in the symphony? And He said, you're darn right you are. And so then I started crying again. God chose every piece of me. He picked every flaw that I used to beat myself up about. And each one of you are His symphony too. When I first started CR, I was so weak I couldn't even stand long enough to get through worship. Cut to 2 years later, not only can I stand and dance through worship, but I have been able to return to work. I serve and am in leadership in CR. I've completed 2 step studies. I serve on the hosting and the production team at church. I just graduated from Advance. I'm a sponsor, and God is using me to help others. For so long, I looked to be accepted by people, and of course that left me feeling very empty. But now I look only to be accepted and loved by God, and it has attracted love in every area of my life. Witnessing the change in my life has made both of my kids believers, and I couldn't be prouder. I broke the generational curse of walking through this life alone, and that's the best gift I could ever give them. Amen. When I look back over my life, I can't help but think of Deuteronomy 28, where it explains the blessings of God as well as the curses of disobedience. I suffered every one of those curses for disobedience, from being left to wander the earth alone to suffering with wasting diseases. But now that I'm seeking Jesus and learning to align my life with His, He's raining down blessings on me every day. I was so empty and lonely and lost, and now I'm filled with light and love and purpose. For 38 years, I prayed for death. When I had my kids, suicide was no longer an option, but that didn't keep me from wishing every day that my life would end. I saw no future, nor did I want one. But for the last 2 years, since I started walking with Christ, He's healed that part of me. Now I pray for life, because I know He has a purpose for me, and I'm excited for my future. Hard times don't get me down anymore. If anything, they fuel me even more, because I know God is using them to build my character and to touch more and more lives. Thank you for listening to my story.